저희 두 번째 연사는 또 멀리서 오셨습니다. 저기 멀리 시드니에서 오셨는데요. 시드니 공과대학에서 지금 강의를 하고 계시고 부교수로 재직 중이신 킬스티 키토 교수님을 모셨습니다. 교수님께서는 오늘 XAPI, 저희가 앞에 캘리퍼 스탠다드에 대해 얘기할 때에도 계속 언급이 되었던 XAPI의 모든 것에 대해서 A부터 Z까지 설명을 자세하게 해드릴 예정입니다. 좀 기지개 펴시고요. 커피도 한잔 하시면서 또 우리 오후 세션도 즐겁게 좀 시작을 해봤으면 좋겠습니다. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Kirsty Kito with a big applause. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me at the back? I'll give you a warning. I have a bit. Oh, you can. I have a bit of a tendency to wander around a little bit on stage. So if I start wandering because I only have this microphone, put your hand up if you can't hear me anymore, and I'll try and come back to the microphone where I belong. I'll also give you another warning. I'm from Australia. And we have a tendency to speed up Australians when we're speaking. So as soon as the translator kind of loses me and you start finding it a bit difficult to hear what I'm saying anymore, again, put your hand up and tell me to slow down, because definitely there's a lot of content that I'm trying to get through here, and I definitely have a tendency to go fast. Okay, so welcome to the second session on learning analytics, and congratulations on staying for the whole afternoon. That's two very long sessions that you've signed up to, so hopefully you're going to get quite a bit out of it. And as we've been hearing in the last session, there's an awful lot of similarity between Caliper and XAPI, so hopefully you're going to start seeing some of those similarities, which is actually a very useful thing to be covering on a whole afternoon like this, because it will give you a really good deep dive into how these different specifications for doing learning analytics can work. So, I entered this field from learning analytics. So my initial concern was not data or data interoperability per se, but I've increasingly become more and more engaged in the XAPI community for a number of years, because I was one of the very early adopters in using Experience API data for doing learning analytics. And we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the whole afternoon. So I might just start with sort of the base motivator for what I do. So what we've seen earlier was very much a ground up from the data up to the sort of analytics and the learning perspective. I'm much more from the top down. I'm very interested in collecting learning data to see how I can help my learners or my educators to improve learning per se. So I'm trying to actually use data in such a way that I can feed insights back to educators, back to learners about what they're doing and how they can improve what they're doing, so that they can become better learners over their whole lifetime. So we all know that learning is something that's going to go on for forever. Like you're not going to just go to university, learn for a couple of years, and then go out into the workforce anymore. Increasingly, our students are going to be coming back to university, going out to the workforce, needing a bit more training, coming back in. So we're going to be entering into very porous relationships. And universities need to start thinking about how they can collect learning data in such a way that it can be used for a lifetime. So this definition of learning analytics was created by the Society for Learning Analytics Research, which is a society I've been involved in for quite a few years now. And if you see here, it's talking about collecting data and stuff about learners and their contexts. And that context is very interesting to me, because that was actually one of my very early research interests for my whole life. And it's for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning. I find that optimizing term a little bit concerning, especially when I start thinking about 21st century competencies or some very complex forms of learning. What an optimum is there is quite interesting and difficult to define. So let's be a little bit concerned there. But we're trying to improve learning outcomes. That's the basic idea behind learning analytics. One of the things I'd like us to think about a lot today is, are we going to improve learning by guiding our learners through a labyrinthine sort of journey where a nice intelligent tutoring system is telling them what to do next and they've lost control and autonomy? They're not going to be very well equipped for entering into the workforce and uncertain and unknowable things that are going to confront them in the workforce. Or are we going to put them in control of their learning and try to give them the tools to become better learners and to improve how they learn throughout their lifetime? So there's different ways of approaching this concept of optimizing and improving learning, and what kind of perspective or how you approach your idea of what good learning is will very much guide the kind of learning analytics that you try to generate. So let me start with these guys. So this was the beginning of my learning analytics journey. And so I was at Queensland University of Technology at the time, and I was teaching one of the big flagship first-year science subjects. And because it was the big first-year flagship science subject, our e-learning people had turned on all of the functionality in Blackboard that they normally turn off. So they'd enabled wikis and chats and stuff and things I'd never heard of. And they'd made a very beautiful environment for me because they wanted the students to be having a very nice experience. What do you think these students are doing? So we also have very new learning spaces. QUT had set up, they'd invested millions of dollars in large collaborative classrooms. These classrooms had 90 students to a class, and it was a team teaching scenario where me and I think 3 other tutors would circulate around helping them through group projects. Project-based learning, no lectures for the whole of the first semester experience. That was the model that was adopted, and that was in 2013 maybe. So this was my first day teaching this class, and I just got them all into their groups that they were going to spend the rest of the semester in while they were learning about science. Science in Context was what the class was called. And right now, these guys are busily exchanging their Facebook IDs, and they're going to do all of their group communication in Facebook. Now, that's great. Students are happy. What do you think happens to the e-learning people who are in charge of learning analytics when they look at the learning data for my subject? They're going to see nothing happening in my class, and they're going to decide that my subject is in danger and the students aren't collaborating properly, and they're going to demand an intervention unless they're clever and they understand that students actually learn in many different environments. So we need to be very careful when we approach learning analytics and we start collecting learning data, because the kinds of questions that we can answer can very much be determined by the kinds of data we can collect. And if we're not careful to think about where the data is missing or what we might have failed to collect, then we're going to start drawing some pretty silly insights from our learning data. So we need to really understand the context. We need to really understand our class, and we really need to understand our learners and the instructors. So some of the best instructors at QUT and indeed at UTS, where I am now, hate learning management systems. They won't go near them. So if you're maybe constructing a heat map, which is telling you how people are using the learning management system, some of your most innovative teachers are going to show up as potentially, not performing, but they might be performing very well indeed. It's just they're performing somewhere else. So we need to think about what data we're missing as much as we think about how to collect our data when we're doing learning analytics. And that's because learning happens anywhere, and increasingly it needs to happen everywhere. So we see increasingly all around the world, people are moving towards experiential learning. They're moving towards learning on the workforce. They're moving towards learning in mentoring and tutoring scenarios. We've got at UTS a very large internship program where the Vice-Chancellor wants every student at UTS to have had an internship-like experience by the time they graduate. Now, if you're doing that, then the kinds of data you've got in your learning management system is only going to tell you a very partial story about all of the experiences, the very rich experiences that your learner has had throughout their university journey. And indeed, one of the biggest problems that Australian universities have is when our students try to claim recognition from learning somewhere else, maybe at school, maybe at another university, maybe in the workplace, then somebody has to sit there and manually work out if they've satisfied the requirements for entry into maybe a master's degree or something like that. And that's despite the fact that we have what's called the Australian Qualifications Framework, which gives you a broad sort of baseline that all universities have to offer their degrees at. So, for example, a bachelor's degree at an Australian university is considered AQF 7, and it means that the course has to have offered a broad and comprehensive introduction to the subject matter of the degree. So all degrees, all universities, to maintain their accrediting status, need to satisfy these kinds of standards in Australia. So even with quite strict legislative requirements about how we train our students, things like recognition prior learning are still very, very difficult. So imagine how much more difficult that's going to become as we enter an age where people lose their jobs, return to university to retrain, but have maybe 5 or 10 years of professional experience and want to actually claim that. Maybe they want to do a short micro course, and many Australian universities are disaggregating a lot of their learning offerings right now. I'm in the process of doing that right now for data science. So as universities are trying to disaggregate their content, make things much more flexible, make it much easier for people to come in and go out of university, make the relationship much more porous, how are we going to understand what people actually know, what they need to know? And what's more, how are we going to start personalising that experience if we only collect a tiny little subset of all of the data that's generated by all of those different traces they leave throughout the web and beyond as they're learning throughout their lifetime? So, luckily, within this context, we have 2 new standards, 2 data standards. Well, neither of them that new anymore. So, XAPI has been around since 2013, and I think CALIPR was released in 2015. So, you know, they're starting to get quite mature now. And we saw that in the talk just before, that CALIPR has come a long way in the space of 2 years. So what we have here is a move beyond some of the traditional ways of collecting data in learning management systems like SCORM and things like that, which assume that you launched a thing and you went off to your activity and it completed, and now you've satisfied Fire Safety Training 101 and you can sit in your office for another 6 months before you have to do the compulsory fire training 101 course again. Yeah, I'm a bit cynical about compulsory compliance-based training. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm kind of sick of compulsory fire training every year or whenever it is I have to do it. And I suspect most of the workforce is. So, we have new ways of collecting data. And both of these standards were generated with the intention of collecting data from anywhere. So, in principle, as both of the specs mature, it should be possible to build learning record providers or sensors or whatever you need that will actually collect data from many different places. So from videos or from simulations, you could have a learner manually entering, I did hang gliding training, or you could have somebody doing quizzes in an LMS. So we should be able to start getting more and more data from all of these different places. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about XAPI, because that's the one I know about. So, Experience API. It's an open specification, so it was created by ADL, which is sort of a pillar of the American military. And it was meant initially as a successor to SCORM, which was quite limited and not working very well with things like mobile technologies. And it was built from the ground up with this sort of recognition that learning happens everywhere. And like we've been hearing before, very simple syntax, okay? Actor, verb, object. So I did something. Kirsty gave a talk. So lots and lots of different ways in which that can be unravelled though, and these things can get very complex very quickly. Now the thing I particularly like about XAPI is it's open source and it's got an open development model. So IMS Caliper is open, like it's an open standard, but one of the things I find a little bit scary about it is I don't get to see how it's developing. It kind of gets plonked on me at the end of the process, which always makes me a little bit terrified because it's something that I then have to deal with rather than something that I get to shape. But it's very good that both standards are open. Like, that makes me very happy indeed, because I'm a big believer in open source software anyway. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the XAPI data flow. And so if you go to the specification, you'll see this image. And the basic idea is the learner has an experience, and this is tracked by a learning record provider. And that learning record provider sends statements off to a learning record store, which stores the records. And then something else, a learning record consumer, accesses the records in that learning record store and does something with them. So generates insights, uses it for learning analytics, things like that. So, just realised these are the old slides. That's okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover this whole flow today. So let's start by thinking about learning record providers. Okay, so the learner has a learning experience. So Kirsty is learning how to give a talk by talking at e-learning career, you know, so every time I give a talk I get a little bit better, I hope. I might be able to record the fact that I'd done that using maybe a data entry portal or something like that. And I might go, I gave a talk, and I store that detail. How does that happen? How do we actually make these things? So one of the things you find with XAPI is there's an awful lot of talk that goes on about learning record stores, but there's very little talk about the learning record providers, and there's even less talk about the learning record consumers. And so it can be quite confusing when you get started with the specification, trying to work out how these statements actually get generated and how you then use them once you've collected them. So I've done a lot of work around learning record providers, and one of the major sort of contributions I've made to the spec was to do with the early work we'd done around collecting social media data and using it putting it into XAPI format so that we could use it in learning analytics applications. So, what's a learning record provider? It's really just something like some sort of software that monitors a learner. So it might be a sensor in Caliper. It might be a learning management system. But to be a learning record provider, there'd have to be a bit of software bolted onto the thing that would pull out the data that is collected by the learning record store and sends it to an LRS. So there's some tech that has to be done. There's some gluing that has to be done as you're building these things. So you need to work out how to access the data that was collected about the learner while they were going through their learning experience. You need to work out how to generate a statement, an XAPI statement, and you need to work out how to send it to a learning record store. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to talk about. So here we've got a few examples of the kinds of things that are going on in the subject I teach, which is called Statistical Thinking for Data Science. So we have over on the left, it's run in Canvas. So we've got a whole heap of Canvas data that's being generated about what my students are doing in there. The students have a group project, and so a lot of them are communicating using Slack. So over here on the right, we've got students, actually that's me communicating with someone, but there's plenty of students doing a whole heap of stuff in another environment. And also I've been actively encouraging them to use GitHub. And so there's a whole heap of activity going on in GitHub with code commits and things like that, because they're doing a group project. And so they always have problems with data sets becoming outdated, or some analysis getting overwritten if they're using the wrong kind of file sharing protocols. And so that's only some of the different environments that my students are using. There's also a lot of them using Trello because they find it really useful for project management. A lot of them like using Google Drive. A lot of them are keeping reflective journals. This semester I've got them doing that in Canvas, but before that we used a homegrown tool. So there's a whole heap of different types of environments here, and to get a complete understanding of what my students are doing, we'd need to be able to collect data from all of them. Okay, so that's quite challenging. On top of that, we don't necessarily know all of the environments where they are doing things. So I haven't mandated which environments they use. They can use whatever helps them with their group project. So this is meant to be a very authentic learning experience. So imagine a group working in a workplace. They'll just use whichever tools work best. So this is a learning experience that runs for the full semester, where my students are very much being encouraged to develop professional skills that they'll need when they enter the workplace. Now, and the other problem that you always have is, because it's a group project, they're always a little bit worried that they're doing more work than everybody else, or this person over here is not doing anything, when actually that person is writing a whole heap of documentation maybe, but this person over here is a coder, and so they only count the code contributions. Or maybe this person over here is doing a lot of project management around just getting the project running. So how do you get the students to understand that there are different ways of contributing to a group project? And most of them are actually very useful. So trying to make visible those different kind of challenges around collaborative activities is a really classic case where learning analytics can potentially help. So back to that example of our students in a group project, how can we pull in all of the data that is potentially useful towards helping them to understand their group dynamics, and hopefully improving them. So one of the real hopes I have for learning analytics as a discipline is that it helps with formative assessment. So there's a lot of people trying to use it for summative assessment, where it's used to automate marking or to make things happen, without the teacher being too involved. I think that's very dangerous, because as soon as you start using AI or you start using classification methods, there will always be inaccuracies coming into your methods. It's very hard to remove all of them. What do you do with the brilliant essay that someone wrote that was completely different from all other essays, and therefore the classifier that you were using to automate the marking of the essay didn't understand that it was a very good essay and potentially failed the student? So unless you've got a human in the loop for some of these things, you can get into a lot of trouble. I think one of the most useful places to put the human into the loop is if it's the student in the loop, because then we're using the analytics to help the student understand more about themselves and about how they can improve their learning. So we're not just forcing them somewhere and making them do better at something for the immediate task that they're involved in. We're actually helping them learn how to learn. Okay, so within the context of these students who are off wandering around beyond the LMS, There's a large project that I've been leading for a number of years, which was started when I was at QUT, but now I'm at UTS. And it was essentially about how we could actually build sort of a learning ecosystem where we weren't held hostage to the learning management system, because we wanted sort of a next generation learning environment, but we still wanted to be able to provide learning analytics. And so this project came out of a think tank that I was involved with at QUT, where a lot of the really innovative teaching and learning people were pulled together into a central unit to think about what QUT would do in response to MOOCs, because they were a threat to our business model. And essentially what we were trying to come up with was a concept of loosely knitted together IT infrastructure, where different educators could use whatever bits and pieces they wanted, and it would all just seamlessly flow. Weren't we idealistic? This was back, 4 years ago or something, before things got hard. But the basic idea is that we need to provide analytics beyond the LMS, and at the same time as I was trying to work out how we could pull the data together from these multiple different environments, Experience API got released as a specification, and I suddenly thought, well, that might work. And so what we've been doing since the early days of XAPI is trying to work out if we can use it for this kind of a use case, and it turns out you can. So here was one of the main outcomes of this project. And basically the Connected Learning Analytics Toolkit, what it does is it goes off to various social media, and it pulls the data in by interfacing with the APIs that those social media make available, stores the data in a learning record store, does some analytics on it, and then sends it off to different contextualized reports. So, students see certain reports, and admin people can see different things in the learning record store. Instructors can see different things. So it doesn't make sense, for example, to do content analysis at the student level because there's not enough data. But as you get more data, maybe at the instructor level, you can start doing things like developing topic models and stuff like that. And so this was an early tool that we were building even when we put the grant in. And some details about the toolkit itself. So the basic philosophy behind this tool is instead of forcing our students into my learning management system or standalone e-learning environment, we go where they are. And we get them to somehow give us access to their data. Now for that, we need to earn their trust in some way, because there's no reason why they would need to hand over their social media accounts. In fact, there's many cases of students who've gotten into an awful lot of trouble when they've handed over their social media accounts to universities. So there's examples of students getting suspended or even expelled from schools for criticising schools or allegedly criticising them on social media. So there's every reason not to hand over your social media account. So basically what we do with the CLA toolkit is we only take the data that pertains to specified learning activities. And so what happens is the student links their social media account with a data scrape for a specific subset of things they might be doing. So an example of that would be Twitter. So we might just take the Twitter hashtag related to a course, and then any tweet that the student makes with that hashtag in it, we collect and store. But if the student doesn't put that hashtag into the tweet, then we just leave it alone. We don't collect it. Facebook, when it was working, Facebook keeps updating their APIs, and it's impossible. I just don't bother with Facebook anymore. So when we were using Facebook, you'd have a private group, and the students would be talking to each other in the private group, and anything that they did in that private group we'd collect the data for, but we wouldn't collect any of the other data. Same GitHub, we only take certain repo activities, all of those kinds of things. So there's a well-established protocol for what data you collect and why you collect it. And because it's a research project, the students can't be forced to sign up. So there's a problem, because you need to actually give them something that makes it worthwhile them signing up. So how do you encourage the students to actually think that this thing is a worthwhile thing to participate in? And one of the sort of classic findings that have come out of this project is how closely you need to integrate your data collection and reporting, your analytics, with the learning design and assessment regime of the subject in order to get student buy-in. And that's something we'll return to in a while. So over here on the right, we see sort of an example of a student-facing dashboard. It's pretty ugly. It's from about 4 years ago, using HighCharts. There's a lot of things we've learnt using that dashboard, so we just kind of built something and threw it at the students to see what they do. And what you find is, yeah, they'll use it. They'll have a look at it. They don't use it much in any kind of a deep or meaningful sense until you start coupling the analytics with learning design. But they can make sense of it. They can reflect on what the data tells them. They overinterpret it. So there's a lot of cases where analytics that we've warned students would be potentially completely useless for their context was used by them in, say, a reflective journal or something like that. So you need to be very careful about what you show them. And so there's a number of findings that we got from just trialling, rapid prototyping and trialling these things, small class contexts, going in and working quite closely with students, getting them to mock up dashboards they'd like to see that would help them with an assessment task, then building those into the design of the next iteration. That was the kind of design philosophy we followed. But we've needed a lot more flexibility, and we've needed a major rewrite of the code base anyway, because it was sort of a lot of student projects all joined together and it's become large and unmanageable. And so we're just in the process of building version 2, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's an example of a learning record provider, okay? How do you build them? So what's under the hood? So let's kind of go down a level into a few more details about what it takes to actually send those statements and to get to the analytics. So here's an example of a simplest possible legal XAPI statement. Whoa, that's pretty simple. It's JSON, so if you don't like JSON, then it probably doesn't look that simple. But if we look over here, there's an actor, there's a verb, and there's an object. So those triples that I promised, they're there. There's a mailbox. So what I've got there is an identifier for a person. There's a verb. So we're talking about the user who has got some sort of a ADL. Yeah, okay, so it's an XAPI user has created something. What have they created? Something that's an activity. Well, I don't know what that means, okay? So the context in which that statement was generated is not stored in there in any really interesting way. And basically, there's not enough information in there for me to do anything with it, okay? So one of the very early mistakes that a lot of people in the learning analytics community made when they started using XAPI was they generated legal statements, lots and lots and lots of them. They got all excited because they had lots and lots of statements in their learning record store. And then they realized that the statements were essentially useless and didn't tell them anything they wanted to know, and they couldn't do anything with them, okay? So this is one of the first big mistakes you can make with XAPI. You cannot store enough information. And this is an advantage of Caliper, like it stops you from doing that, because if you've got the statement being generated, it's got some interesting information in it, okay? So there's pluses and minuses between the two specs. The real positive here, though, is it's really easy to generate these things. You can get them up and running really quickly, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's just go back. So here's a bit of a screenshot from the specification for XAPI. So here we have all the things that are in a statement legally. So the properties of an XAPI statement. And the important thing to look at over here is the required column over here on the right. Okay, so what's required and what's optional and what's recommended. And back to how simple that statement was, not much is required. So you can get away with a very, very lightweight statement in XAPI. But there's a lot of stuff that you could store, but you don't have to, okay? So that's interesting. So as you get more advanced, you can start, increasing the complexity of your statement. And this is one of the real advantages of the specification. It's loose and fast. It lets you get up and running very quickly, and you can just have something, and then you can start refining it and extending it as your understanding of what you need in the data model improves. Okay, so let's look here. Here's a bit more of a realistic XAPI statement. This is a statement that I'm currently generating because I'm trying to get data out of Canvas for my subject. So this is a statement we've generated by accessing the Canvas API and pulling the data out. And so let's have a look inside. There's an actor. So I'm not sure if you can see it at the back, but that's just a few extra bits and pieces stored with the actor. So now instead of just having the the mailbox with my email, we've also got my name, we've got that I'm an agent, and we've got a unique identifier. So that's very important. We've got a verb. So we've got that I'm creating something here. Yep, okay. And we've got an object. Okay, so here we're talking about the kind of thing I'm creating, and what we've got here underneath, essentially the ID, well, the ID is the actual topic, so the discussion topic that I've created as a person. I'm calling it a note, and underneath we've got description. So that's actually being used here to store the text that I wrote when I created that discussion post entry. And the reason we do that is we do a lot of text analysis, so I kind of like storing the text. That's very important for the CLA toolkit because a lot of the social media APIs have limitations when you try to access them. So if you try to go back and get the data later, you get into a lot of trouble. But that doesn't happen very often. Not very many people using XAPI store that information. There's one other thing I want you to see here, which is very important. And that's essentially the context, okay? That's where all the goodies are in Experience API. So all of the things that you need to do learning analytics well generally happen in the context. So here I've got the platform, it's Canvas. That's handy because if I want to maybe make an activity diagram where I talk about relative activity in Canvas versus Twitter versus GitHub versus whatever, I'd like to know which platform it is. I've got the schema, the thing, oh, don't worry about that too much. I've got the parent note, so what I was essentially replying to when I posted that thing. We've got some other information, and then right down the bottom we've got some stuff around timestamp, authority, things like that, and a lot of that's a bit more, I'm not going to go into that because that'll just scare you. It's not very complicated. Okay. I'm just wondering, can we swap to my other slides, or is it... So the updated slides, is it possible? They were on the USB, so they got uploaded at lunch. If it's too much, don't worry, we can do without them. They were in the speakers room. They're still, don't worry, that's all right, I'll keep going. Okay, so a bit more information about an actor. So an actor is essentially just an individual or group performing some sort of an action. Okay, so it's quite simple, okay? They could be an agent, in which case they're an individual, or they could be a group. And so XAPI lets you do those two things. Notice that Caliper had a lot of other things that you can have as whatever they were. What were they? I can't remember. But basically, XAPI deals with those two. And they're basically the thing that's doing the learning in XAPI. Okay? So one of the things I always notice in Caliper is that you have a lot of this other information about other things going on. which is actually very useful sometimes, but also makes things a bit more complicated when you start thinking about what's going on in the statements. But generally, the actor in an XAPI statement is the thing that's learning. Okay, and they can have lots of different forms. Okay, so they can basically, they could be in social media, they could be in the LMS, they could be in lots of different pieces, they could be coming in with different identifiers into the LRS. So you could be storing a lot of XAPI statements about one actor with a lot of different identifiers, okay? So you, at some point, then need to resolve that, okay? And basically the persona is the kind of thing that you talk about when you're talking about how you resolve that. But basically you have a mapping between those different identifiers that you need to generate, and that's not in the spec. That's something that you have to do as the creator of statements or the person who's building the architecture. And it can take a lot of effort. And then basically what you're doing is you're storing information about an individual in the LRS. You can, most LRSs will store statements about multiple actors, but you can set them up so that each different persona has a different endpoint, and you'd be collecting personal data about a personal person. You'd be collecting data just about one person in each LRS. That's possible with the technology. I haven't seen very many people doing that, and it makes me very sad because I actually think really the strength of both Caliper and XAPI will come from the point where people have personal record stores that they can take with them for a lifetime, where they can collect all of their learning data about everything they've done and use it to claim that prior learning. They can use it to go, no, I don't need to do the compulsory fire safety thing over here because I just did it last week in a different, floor. It's the same test. So when people can actually start using their learning data to claim competency, to claim prior recognition, to start personalising their learning experience based on what they've already done and what they've excelled at, that's when these kinds of specifications will really become very useful. But right now, people are just in very early stages of collecting the data. I see very little interesting things going on right now. A lot of it's mainly being used for analytics and a bit of high-end reporting. Compliance. A lot of it's about compliance. Who did compulsory fire safety training? We could have done that without all of this extra specification hoo-ha, yeah? We don't really, that's a boring use case. So I challenge you all to go off and come up with some more interesting use cases. How can you actually help learners to personalise their experience, claim recognition, do more interesting things, skip the early training because they've obviously already mastered it? That's when these kinds of specifications, both Caliper and XAPI, are really going to become useful. Verbs. Okay, so a verb essentially defines the action between the actor and the activity, or the actor and the object. So normally an object takes the form of an activity. Specification doesn't say anything about what the verbs are, so that's a real big difference between Caliper and XAPI. XAPI is the Wild West. You can do whatever you like. So we give you enough rope to completely hang yourself, okay? And a lot of people have. So be very careful, okay? A little bit of care in defining verbs and ontologies and mappings and things like that goes a very long way. And one of the big early contributions that we made with this Beyond the LMS project was pointing to that necessity. So actually in taking a lot of care to define a recipe, was what it was called back then, for social media, we pointed out the need for this kind of care in terms of interoperably mapping between verbs, interoperably mapping between different sort of parts of an XAPI statement. And that became very obvious that you needed to do that with our use case because, for example, a Twitter tweet, which will come back from the Twitter API as a tweet, will look very, very similar to a Canvas post or a Facebook post or a whatever. So are you going to store all of them as tweets and posts and all of those things? Or are you going to take a little bit of care to map all of those different types of things in different environments into one term and maybe call it a note? So the reason why we're talking about creating a note in the example statement that I just showed you is because actually a lot of different things that you might be describing using XAPI would fall into that same category. So what we've done is we've harmonized how we refer to this social media data using essentially a recipe. Ooh. Have you got the... Oh, cool. Stand up and jump around a bit because it's been a long afternoon and it's about to get even more technical.
뭐 뜻하지 않게 잠깐 브레이크 타임을 갖게 돼서요. 혹시 질의응답 있으시면 지금 한 분 정도 질의응답을 받도록 하겠습니다. 아직까지 저희가 심플로우 통해서 받은 질의응답 메시지는 없는데요. 네. 네, XAP에 대한 질문은 아직까지는 없으신 걸로. 잠깐 스트레칭하는 시간 가지실까요? 100분이 아주 긴 시간이라고는 할 수는 없지만 아주 짧은 시간도 아니기 때문에 스트레칭 하시고요. 밖에 커피가 약간 준비되어 있는 것 같긴 합니다. 그래서 혹시 필요하신 분들은 가져오셔도 좋을 것 같습니다.
Thank you. All right, we're back with new and improved slides. Or do you want to? You can keep going. Or okay, okay. So thinking about what's going on in your data model is very, very important when you're building these things. And it can get you a long way. So we spent, when we started using XAPI, we spent about, I think, maybe 4 or 5 months thinking about the data model. It took us 2 weeks to build the analytics. The analytics was very, very easy once you had that data model up and running. So last bit in terms of the things that you need, objects. So normally, what these are doing is defining the thing that's acted on. So it could be an activity, could be an agent or a group. You could be acting on a sub-statement and a statement reference. So go and read the spec for those last two. I'm not really, I mean, they're just bits and pieces. But anyway, the important thing is if you think about what is here in this object, so there's a required ID. You don't even need a definition necessarily according to the spec. So there's very little information that's required to be stored about this object. And again, it's a bit like that context thing. Most of the stuff that you want to know is optional. So you need to be very, very careful when you're building learning record providers to set them up such that they're storing the information that you're going to consider necessary. Now that's quite an advantage because you only have what you need, and it can be very quick to get up and running. But it's a really classic trap that I've seen a lot of people fall into when they've started using XAPI. Okay. A great website to go and have a look at, if you want to find out more about the statements per se, would be this Statement Explorer that's available on the xapi.com website. So that one lets you just click on different bits of the statement and find out a little bit more of it, link to different bits of the spec. So it can be a nice resource for starting to understand what the anatomy of these statements is. But really they look a lot scarier than they are. And if you've used JSON at all, then they shouldn't look scary at all. It's really just a type, a structured form of JSON. Okay, so that's statements. So we've thought about the learner doing an activity, and we've thought about the kind of statement that you'd use to describe that activity. But where do the statements go? So, and how do we even make them? Like, wait a minute, that means maybe I have, let me just skip out and have a look. I just have to make sure we're in the place where I thought we were. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so anyone remember where they go? If we think back to the XAPI data flow, where were they meant to go? Here's a quick spot test for you all. If you get it right, you can store it in your learning record store. Oh no, she gave it away. So they go to a learning record store, okay? So we're on to the next bit. So we're talking about the activity, and we're talking about tracking that learning, well, tracking the activity using the learning record provider. Now that learning record provider has to create and send those learning records somewhere, and that somewhere is a learning record store. Okay, so now we're going to kind of talk about this section in the middle. Here's an example of a learning record store. So here's where a bunch of those statements, like the ones that I was just talking about, have ended up. So here's us playing around with getting Canvas data out of Canvas and storing it in a learning record store. So here's me and some of my students doing stuff in Canvas. We're just looking at discussion fora at the moment. And if we click on any one of those things in there, oh look, here's the statement that I was showing you earlier. Okay, so that statement's ended up in the learning record store. Cool, okay. How did it get there? Anyone spotted that yet? There's like a missing piece of the puzzle, isn't there? Okay, so there's a little bit of plumbing we have to put in place to get the statement into the learning record store first. Okay, but first things first, basically a learning record store is a thing that accepts and can send XAPI statements. So it can send them onto other learning record stores, you can pull it out, you can do things like that. So it's got sort of some pagination and some basic querying. But like I was saying before, I'm not super happy with the sort of retrieval and search functionality of any of the learning record stores. According to the spec, they're not allowed to do a lot. But basically, what it is a thing that just collects statements. Really, I use learning record stores as statement validators, because if you've got a good one, then it won't accept your statements if they're not legal. So it's a great way of testing if your XAPI statement is a good statement or not. Because it'll give you error messages if your statement is badly formed. It will accept them if they're correct, and it'll just give you a place to put them all while you're trying to work out what to do with them. So there's an awful lot of effort in the XAPI community that goes towards putting analytics into the learning record stores. But quite frankly, most of the vendors that are building these LRSs don't understand the kind of analytics I'm after, and they give me terrible analytics, which makes me sad and annoyed and frustrated. So, while they are generally improving, they're more like things that are just for capturing data from multiple learning record providers, in my view, and then I pull the data out and I do something else. So I turn into a learning record consumer on the other side. But there's lots of people who've gone a long way just using a learning record store and doing some basic institutional reporting and things like that. There's some quite good free learning record stores that you can go and play with and set up an account and have a look at what the analytics looks like. But a lot of it will be things like counts of the number of verbs that have been stored, which to me is not very useful. To you it might be, it depends on your use case. So for example, the one I just showed you was a new entrant by a lot of the ex-ADL people, Veracity, and you can get a free account there. They've even got some example statements in there, so you can set up and play around with your own learning record store just by doing it. There's the Learning Locker offering by HT2, which has just gone through a major upgrade, I think last year's, much better again. And Rusticy's got Watershed as a free offering now as well. So there's quite a few bits of technology out there that you can get up and running with very easily. You can just get a free account in any of those 3 LRSs and start sending statements, and some of them even have example data in there that you can go and have a look at if you want to see what XAPI stuff looks like. So one of the real advantages with XAPI at the moment is just because it's a little bit more mature, there's a lot more tech that's around already that helps you get up and running. And another example of that would be HT2's released a MOOC on getting up and running with XAPI. So running a learning record store in 4 weeks, I bet you could do it faster than that. By the way, it looks like that's running Curator. Has anyone seen the HT2 Curator environment? It's an example of very extreme social learning. That's kind of how they created it. If you're interested in that, you might want to go and have a look at the MOOC and see what you think about it. But it's kind of an aggregator of web resources, and it generates a whole heap of XAPI statements to boot. So there's a course you can do. Okay, so remember I said there's a bit of the plumbing missing where you need to work out how to make the XAPI statement, so we know what it needs to look like, but we need to make it as well. And then we need to send the XAPI statement off to the LRS. Okay, so there are a couple of really nice tutorials online that I found while I was trying to work out what to say about this for this talk. Thoroughly recommend both of them. So there's just a nice article that tells you how to get up and running with sending XAPI statements very quickly. There's also a set of videos that you can find on that LinkedIn site which guide you through the process of setting this thing up. But here's an example script that comes from that Learning Solutions Mag article. And basically what you do is you need to define a variable that holds the LRS. So you need to define the endpoint where your statements go. And so that's going on up there. I need a pointer. Have you got a pointer? Sorry. Oh, this one? No. Oh, thank you. Yes. Okay. So up here we have essentially defined the ADL LRS, and we've defined the authentication that's going to be used. Okay. So this is part of a function, and this function is made available using this XAPI wrapper, which is a package I'll talk about in a minute. Then we have to update the configuration of the XAPI wrapper. So it's just a little bit of JavaScript we're doing. I don't even know JavaScript, and I can read this, you know. Okay, so, and then down here, we're defining a statement. We're defining, and we're actually hardwiring a statement, okay? So this is a very simple example of setting up an XAPI statement. But here we go. We've got an actor, we've got a verb, and we've got an object. Now, if you're any good at coding, you should be able to work out pretty quickly how you could extract some of these, turn them into variables, and essentially call this function with those variables and generate your own statements. Yeah? If you don't understand what I'm talking about there, work through this video. There's 3 videos which go through step by step exactly how to do that. So they'll actually walk you through it. I think they're only 10 to 15 minutes per video. Really nice, slow pace, and they'll get you up and running sending XAPI statements very, very quickly. Okay, so what we've got here is we've defined the LRS and the endpoint. We've told the wrapper to use that LRS. We've made the variable that's holding the XAPI statement, and down here we're sending the statement. Okay? So that's the 4 steps. And that's, you know, about as simple as it gets. The fact that I can fit it on one PowerPoint slide shows you that it is pretty simple, okay? Like, you know, there's not many code, like there's not many computer programs you see in the world that are, you know, fittable on one slide. So, you know, you can get up and running very quickly. Now, a bit of information about the wrapper. So this is another bit of a tool that's been released by ADL. And so essentially this is the thing that generates legal statements for you, sends them to the LRS, helps you with configuration of endpoints, all of that kind of stuff. You can find it on GitHub at that website there. And there's actually, if you go back here, there's the reference documentation. That's actually very handy, nicely set up reference documentation that shows you everything that's available inside the wrapper. So if you go looking over here, you can prepare statements, send them. You can, there should be, oh, you can send multiple statements at once. So there's a whole heap of different bits and pieces that the wrapper shows you. And so this is essentially a legal way of interfacing with a learning record store. Notice there's stuff around getting information out as well. So it provides you with not just the functionality for sending statements, it also gives you some of the functionality for pulling data out of an LRS if you want to start building solutions. Okay, so that's quite a bit of sort of infrastructure that's in place to try and make it relatively easy to get up and running. If you're familiar with HTML, a bit of JavaScript and stuff, you can have something working in an hour, probably. Probably less than that, actually. Okay, so some things you could get wrong, because there's a lot of things you can get wrong, but here are the ones I thought of. The version of the spec that's supported by your LRS can be very important. So in particular, 1.03 of XAPI is quite a bit stricter than some of the earlier versions of the spec. Which can mean that if you're using an LRS that's implementing version 1.03 and you're using, for example, the old tin can wrapper or something like that, then you might find that your statements are getting rejected. So there's just a little kind of niggle there that you have to be a bit careful with. Often you need well-defined web links and things like that. So, you know, the mail to in defining an agent is essential, otherwise you could have your statement rejected. So things like that can be very easy to get wrong because you might think that you just need to put the string in, which is the email, and then you'll have your statements getting rejected. Make sure you use the statement validators. They can help you a lot. So the ADL website has links to a lot of statement validators. Most of the LRSs have statement validation tools in them as well. And yeah, the log files in the LRS, they're great. If you've got a good LRS, they'll tell you a lot of things. Okay, so like I said, the main thing I use LRSs for is validating my XAPI. And so quite often, the thing that will take your time is constructing a legal statement, like making sure that your LRP, like your learning record provider, is doing the right thing. The LRS is a really good way of doing that. Okay, how am I going for time? Oh, I'm going fine. Context. So remember I said context is everything, and remember we said that it was optional? Okay. This is where I rant about XAPI being really annoying. So, you know, from a learning analytics perspective, that's not optional, okay? That's just not optional at all. If you're trying to do learning analytics and you're not storing context information, then you are not trying very hard at all. And your learning analytics is going to be miserable and impoverished, and it certainly won't help learners learn anything, okay? I can say that with, you know, almost, like, I have never seen a case where context was not used and useful analytics came out. So not optional, not if you're doing learning analytics. If you're using XAPI for performance analytics or just to see if your workforce is completing training and things like that, you can probably get away without it. It'll probably be okay. But if you're trying to do something interesting with XAPI, then you're going to need context. So not optional at all. But how big is it? So, and this is where I think Caliper has quite an advantage, because they're very carefully thinking about what a context is and very slowly building a context up such that there's going to be harmony across all of them. So here is what is stored in an XAPI context at the moment according to the spec. So you've got things like the instructor, the team, context activities, whatever that is, parent, grouping, community or other, revision. I mean, none of that's very interesting to me so far. It's kind of boring from an analytics perspective. Platform, okay, that's getting a bit interesting. That's actually very useful for me for activity charts and things. I was showing you that one before. And extensions. Notice here, you know, a map of any other domain-specific context relevant to this statement, okay? So, you know, for example, in a flight simulator, things like altitude, airspeed, wind, you know, the things that I care about normally tend to end up here, okay? So even when you're looking at how the spec specifies context, it kind of underspecifies it, okay? And what the spec does say is that communities of practice are expected to get together and define how context is going to be used for the particular use case, okay? So we've had a lot of influence in terms of how social media data is used because we were using it first and we defined the connected learning recipe. For example, now there's things like medical devices, there's a video profile and things like that as well. So there's a whole heap of people starting to form into communities which work through that. The IMS sort of profiles development work is a similar kind of problem or a similar solution, but the solution is top-down, whereas the XAPI one's bottom-up. So they've both got their pros and cons. Like, we're a bit of a rabble, but we move quickly. And IMS Caliper tends to be much better defined, but is moving much slower. So it's sort of, you know, it just depends on what development model you prefer. Okay, so like I was saying, that one's important. Now let's just think about this. How long does this have to make sense for? And this comes back to what Marcus was talking about. Ideally, we'd be able to use this data for a long, long time. And keep in mind as well, I've been talking about lifelong learning. I've been talking about, you know, people who are going to be coming back to university throughout their whole learning journey. So JISC, which is the organisation in the UK that's done a lot of work with XAPI and other things beyond, they had a project from, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago. So I showed this slide at a meeting, okay, thank you, at an XAPI camp at JISC, and the guy who made this image went, oh, I made that image 10 years ago. But if we think about personalised lifelong learning, this is something that is going to go on for 60 years, potentially. So context has to make sense for a very long time. All of our statements need to make sense for a very long time if our learners are going to be able to use them in that porous, in and out of university, personalised, lifelong, adaptive learning kind of context. So this is when I started getting very interested in data interoperability. Because unless we actually start really taking this very seriously right now, we're going to have a whole heap of very disparate things. We've already got 2 standards, which is one too many. And we're going to have a lot of trouble getting our data into a form such that we can use it in a productive manner. Now, I'm inherently lazy, and the idea of having to do everything multiple times really doesn't appeal to me at all. So we really need to get our act together now, okay? And just like Marcus was saying, we don't want a 3rd standard. What we need to do is work out how we're going to get these things all working together. So, the way I see it, there's 2 basic ways to get towards data interoperability. And you can kind of see these 2 ways in the Caliper versus XAPI story, which is actually really interesting because it kind of gets at the underlying difference between in the philosophy of the 2 specs. So, are you going to go big and comprehensive, or are you going to be loose and modular? Okay. Now, you can kind of guess what I like more because of the way I talked about that, but that's all right. They're both very viable solutions, okay? So you could ensure that all EdTech is going to use one data stack. Like, that would actually be a very viable way to go, and that's essentially what IMS is currently doing with Caliper. And it's actually the better way, I think, to go if you can get it to work, because essentially you've got one knowable, defined, set of data that makes sense across all systems. It's used by everyone, kind of makes sense, okay? But the problems that come up very quickly. So how long would that stack make sense for? And you can see that with how the profiles are being added to Caliper now. Like they have to keep evolving, but it's in development, so that's fair enough. How quickly will your big comprehensive solution evolve? So as you get new technology emerging, 20 years from now, what's EdTech going to look like? It's going to be vastly different. How will your big comprehensive data stack keep up? Who's in control of it? So the politics of that become interesting. And how comprehensive can it be? What if you've got some weird little outlier use case that only 20 people want to use over here, but it's not catered for in your big and completely comprehensive spec? There's not really any reason why the big and comprehensive spec should have to move for those, dumb 20 people over here. Right? Why couldn't they just get on board? So, there'll always be outliers like that. So it's very hard to achieve that big comprehensive stack. I still think that that's something we need to be trying to do. So I'm very glad that IMS is doing that, because I don't want to do that. But, it's a big, tough road to go down. And you can see that from some of what was being talked about earlier. Or you could try and do, in contrast, something a bit more modular. So you could try and be a bit more kind of loose and modular. So you can, if you go this way, then it's much easier to get up and running. It's much easier to generate statements or to make data very quickly. But then you need to ensure that there's a way to kind of map data between different providers in some sort of way. So you need to kind of come along behind and clean up. And that's kind of what XAPI has done. So, perfectly honest, both solution has its advantages and its disadvantages. XAPI has got a whole heap of bad practice because of that loose and modular perspective. But if you're following best practice, then you've got some pretty good data that you can do a lot of things with. And you've got data that probably won't be represented by Caliper for a very long time, okay? So it's just about what's your use case, what's your scenario you're trying to generate learning data for, is your learning scenario covered by the Caliper specification? How soon will it be? Have you got IMS global membership? So there's a lot of things that weigh in to how you make the decision about which of the two standards you follow. Ideally, what will happen is they'll both start harmonizing, and it won't matter as much, because really, quite frankly, for that learner who comes to my university, it really shouldn't matter what data standard we chose to use. It should just be that the data makes sense for them for their lifetime. So we owe it to our learners to actually get this working. Okay, so the XAPI way of dealing with this problem, like I said, was initially communities of practice would get together and define recipes. These have moved on to what are called XAPI profiles, which are using JSON linked data, and all of the standard semantic web stuff, so all your SCOS mappings and all of that stuff as well. And what we see is that Caliper and XAPI come even closer together. So, this is a good news story because things are harmonizing, which makes me very happy. The funny thing about this was I wrote a paper for the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference a couple of years ago as part of this project, where we were talking about how it's ridiculous that XAPI doesn't use linked data right at the time that they were building the profile specification. So that made me super happy when they got announced at the same conference where I was presenting the paper about how they should do it. So, the spec moves very quickly, which is nice to see. Okay, so basically what you do is communities come together and they define a profile, which is something that you can find on the web. You've got all of your standard sort of semantic technologies. You've got, have I got an example of one? I don't think I put one into my slides. But basically what you've got is just some extra structure in your linked data with a whole heap of web links. If you want to see some examples of them, there's a vocabulary and profile server that's been released, and all of the published profiles at the moment are available on that, and that will be expanding fairly quickly. The properties of a profile, back to the spec, so this is now for the profile specification, include things like the ID of the profile, context. Notice, context is required. See, a little bit of me gets so much happier now, you know. So, like, basically what's happened is you've got a low-level specification that's very loose and sloppy, and then some higher-level structure that's put on top of it with a second specification that's harder to adhere to, but gives you better behaved statements, okay? So a learning record provider can choose what they implement, which means you can get up and running quick and dirty, but then gradually you can try to harmonise towards this better implementation. And you've got a whole heap of other stuff in there as well. So it's a good read. Go and have a look at the spec if you want to find out about it a bit more.
Can I ask a quick one?
Yeah.
Are there validators for your profile?
In progress. There needs to be, yeah. We can chat about that later because that's a current project. So basically, if you want to use a profile in a statement, then really all you do is add it. So you add some extra information into your statement itself saying which profile it adheres to. That's all. So it's just part of the specification of your statement. So here's an example of a medical training profile. Well, not the profile, the documentation. So Medbiquitous, I can't even say it, has quite an active community of practice around medical devices. And so here we see one of the strengths of XAPI, because this isn't something that like your big and comprehensive approach is likely to get to very quickly, because it's quite a specialised use case. But they've gone off and defined a profile, which means that any medical device that adheres to their profile specification, you know, will sort of make sense and be interoperable across the world. So this gives you a nice quick way of rapidly forming communities as you need to. Here's another one for serious games. So here's an interactions model that's been generated. There's a whole heap of work that's been going on with that as part of a large European project. Okay, so here's two use cases of something that's a bit more out on the edge, that's unlikely to be reached by IMS very quickly, but which is up and running now in XAPI. So, and this kind of shows the usefulness of having both specifications existing at the moment, and the way I kind of see it, XAPI is the quick, rapid development model, with Caliper coming up the rear a bit more slowly and defining things in a much more comprehensive way, and that's probably how it will work out in the long run. If you want to find out more about profiles, then you can find a whole heap of the published profiles, like the defined vocabulary that currently exists at that profile server. There's some examples of some other ones. So you'll see there's a video profile that's been published. The CMI5 one is essentially about LMS data, and that's probably the most comprehensive profile that's been released to date. And the specifications are good first read. This is not a bad introduction to why they're being used, but I would hope after Marcus's talk that you all understand the importance of data interoperability, so you should get that already. Okay, so here, like the very existence of profiles kind of points to the tension and the dilemma with XAPI, right? So on the one hand, it has a lot of advantages, you know, so it's lightweight, it's really easy to develop in. But, you know, the downside, it's the Wild West. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of stuff going on that really shouldn't be going on because the rules aren't that well, you know, like, the rules are quite light, okay? They let you do a lot of things. And so, you know, some communities of practice are moving really fast, and the Medbiquitous one and the CMI5, for example, are good examples. I have to admit I'm a bit of a laggard. I've been too busy to get the connected learning one up and running well, so the social media stuff's lagging a bit, and that's my own fault. But we're working on that, and there's a community forming around it. But, you know, essentially, there's pluses and minuses with the spec, and you just need to be aware of what they are. The thing that I think is the really big positive for XAPI is anyone can join in. It's really easy to join in and influence development. You don't have to sort of join the consortium. But that does mean that you get some pretty weird people joining sometimes too. Okay, so here, without common practices, XAPI statements will only make sense in the ecosystem where they're defined. And that's the thing that makes me very worried as an educator, because we need to make sure that that's not the case, okay? So when all the dust is settled, and we've got this harmonisation between Caliper and XAPI, it will be because that needs to happen, okay? Well, that shouldn't happen. We need to make sure that that does not happen. Okay, we're on to the final bit. Okay, so we've stored the data in a learning record store. Well, we've tracked some activity, generated a statement, stored some stuff. Now, like I was saying before, I don't really like the analytics that's provided with the learning record store. What can we do? And back to the example, you know, there's a stack of stuff you can do. You can pull out, if you can pull out your XAPI data, then you can do your own sophisticated analytics on it. You can do a whole heap of other reporting. That's a learning record store, but here's essentially analytics that we've generated from XAPI using, well, actually we stored the data in a Postgres database for that, and then send it off to HighCharts dashboards. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the kinds of large-scale learning analytics infrastructure that's been built using this kind of thing. So, you know, like I've been saying, well, if you've been paying attention to me, who's been paying attention to me? Who's asleep? It's the afternoon, you could all be asleep. Some of you, oh, okay, some of you are smiling. I guess some of you are paying attention. So, if we think about this, I've been saying that, you know, it's a bit of the Wild West with XAPI. You could be led to believe that only small-scale vendors are using it, but that's not the case at all, okay? So I want to sort of finish up with some examples of large-scale infrastructure projects that have been built very effectively using this approach, and some of the influence they've had. And probably the most famous one at the moment would be the JISC project, the Effective Learning Analytics project. So JISC is responsible for the data infrastructure of the UK, so the United Kingdom. They're like the Keras equivalent, I guess, are they? Are they the Keras equivalent? Basically, what they've done is they've used XAPI to inform their data model, and they've generated an entire set of learning analytics tools. They've got a freemium offering that universities, if they sign up to the JISC sort of infrastructure, get for free, and then if they build up bespoke sort of solutions for universities as their learning analytics sort of infrastructure and capabilities improve. And one of the things that they've found that's, I think, most relevant for this conference is there's a lot of universities coming to them saying, oh, we want learning analytics, who aren't ready for it, aren't ready at all. And in fact, what they've done is they've generated an institutional readiness check that they get universities to go through before they'll do any work with them at all, which includes looking for things like senior staff who are supporting of the project, you know, an understanding of the data that the university has, skills and capabilities, so, you know, the academics and the instructor capability. So there's a whole heap of things that your institution has to have working before there's any point at all going anywhere near learning analytics. And I'd say one of the biggest things you should be asking before you go anywhere near learning analytics is there, you know, what's the question I'm trying to resolve? What's my problem that data will help me solve? because universities obviously have a limited budget, and you could be spending a lot of your money, or institutions, schools, anything, you could be spending a lot of your money on something that's not going to help you solve anything. You could also be spending a lot of your money on something that's going to drive you towards learning outcomes that you didn't even want. So for example, you might be pushing your sort of learning ecosystem towards a scenario where compliance becomes the norm. So, you know, instructors are constantly checked up on, you know, how active are students in the class. That would be a very easy first question to ask of learning analytics. But is it going to actually give you anything that you wanted? Is it going to help you do what you were hoping to get towards? And one of the outcomes of the LACE project, so the Learning Analytics Community Exchange, was I think it was a position paper, a white paper about, I think maybe 13 visions of learning analytics, something like that. And you know, there were things like learning analytics will be used to make a better world where all students learn productively, and or learning analytics will be used to check everybody up, and like, you know, and they're all very viable outcomes for how learning analytics could be used, and they all make sense in different institutional settings. So one of the things I'd recommend you do if you were seriously thinking about implementing learning analytics at your organisation is to have a very good read of that position paper first and really think about, well, what is the kind of world you're trying to generate here before you start formulating your questions, and then build your architecture and your infrastructure to support that. So another large project is the Apereo Open Learning Analytics Platform, which is gradually kind of building up a set of like tools which are all using, well, a lot of them are, well, okay, using XAPI. They have also got the iOS Caliper spec working in there now, and I think the OpenLRS works with Caliper, doesn't it, as well? Yeah, yeah. So there's a whole heap of infrastructure, and this is being rolled out across multiple universities. I think the Netherlands is going this way, so the whole of the Netherlands is going to be using the Apereo OLA kind of architecture. So large sort of, you know, national bodies are moving towards these kinds of infrastructures, and, you know, getting really nice results out of them in terms of sort of different levels of support and architecture that you can use. So that brings us to the question of, well, what about UTS? What's happening at my institution, and what am I doing now? What was my question? I've forgotten my question. So I mentioned before that we're onto CLA Toolkit version 2. The whole point of version 2 of the toolkit is we've decoupled everything. Oh, that was my question. So back to the loose and modular, or big and comprehensive solution, okay? If we think about the CLA Toolkit version 1, what happened that was wrong with the code base was it got all muddled up and all very tightly coupled. Everything ended up very, you know, in direct communication with everything else. And so what we're doing now is, as we're trying to scale up that solution to an entire institutional setting, is we're starting to think about, well, how can we make sure that everything's very, very modular? Okay, and the LRS is integral to that, because basically what it's doing is it's letting us collect all of our data from multiple different places and store it before we do something else. So the CLA Toolkit is now, well, in version 2, working just as a data collector. So it's a sensor in the Caliper kind of specification would be a way of thinking about it. We've got a Canvas data aggregator that we're building, and then we're going to be adding other sources of activity data as we go. So we've got a number of different projects at the Connected Intelligence Centre that build different learning analytics products. So for example, OnTask, which is sort of sends personalised emails to students at scale based on their activity, would be a classic thing to be using, where if we get a whole heap of data from multiple environments into a learning record store and then out to something else, we could pipe it through to an on-task solution and we could send personalised emails to students at scale. So what we're moving towards is this. So, and I really want to emphasise this. This is not just for universities, but there's a really nice blog post by George Kroner from a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, which again is sort of building on work that other people have been doing for even longer. And he talks about, what does your architecture look like? Does it look like this? Do you have a whole heap of point-to-point couplings where everything's talking to everything else directly? What does that lead to? So one of the biggest problems that universities have, and I'm sure schools and many other systems do as well, is we try to change our LMS, or we try to change our student information system, or something's not fit for purpose anymore, our warehouse, and so we try to swap it out and replace it with something else. That is a major undertaking, okay? It's a terrible undertaking, and for that reason it almost never gets done, which means that we all get stuck with these horrible LMSs or terrible student information systems or god-awful data warehouses that don't do anything like what we need because they're too hard to change, okay? And that's because we let that happen, okay? So we need to stop that happening. And basically what George Kroner was proposing in this blog post was really what universities should be doing is publishing APIs. And really, ideally, we'd be doing this as a collective where we all get to go together and go, here's our API. If you want to sell anything to us as a vendor, you interface with that. No more stuffing around with single sign-on or weird LMS integrations with a student information system that you built in-house or whatever. This is our API. Everything talks via that. Nothing talks directly to anything else, okay? And so this is what we're trying to build at the moment. We're trying to build up a university API. And we're only in the early steps, but we're starting to get a good proof of concept running. But basically, this is the idea. So we have all of these learning record providers sending data to a learning record store. This is just activity data, by the way. There'll be another connection for other kinds of data. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep flexibility by using a GraphQL schema. So GraphQL's a way of dealing with, a sort of a new way of dealing with APIs that was released by Facebook because they had so much data that they were finding it hard to essentially change functionality and amend architectures because REST APIs were too brittle, so they couldn't evolve them as they needed to. And this is a classic problem in learning analytics. So let's say you have a new report that you're trying to build, or you've got a new service that you're connecting up. And this was a problem that happened with the CLA Toolkit version 1 a lot. We'd add something in, and it would break the back-end database tables because suddenly something would change, and then all our analytics would be broken over here. Okay, so it was very hard because you weren't decoupled to change your infrastructure or to add to it without actually breaking a lot of functionality. GraphQL gives us a really nice flexible way of doing that because essentially what a schema does is it promises that certain services will be provided by your architecture. And you've got these resolvers that go off and get the information from other places. So we're investing in that at the moment. And this is kind of like the thing that I'm thinking about a lot of late. So basically what GraphQL gives you is an abstraction where all your XAPI stuff or your Caliper stuff is back over here. Doesn't really matter whose it is. Here you've got an abstraction of the two, and all you need to do is make sure your schema can deal with both of them, and you're off. Your analytics is built for the GraphQL schema, it's not built for XAPI or Caliper. And I think that will work, but you might need to wait for a while because it's quite a complicated thing to set up, but we're getting there, So the thing I really like about it is it's quite efficient, so it only retrieves the information that you need, and that's really important for student-facing analytics because students are increasingly accessing things over mobile. It's very flexible, it's very strongly typed, And so really what it gives you is a promise between the front end and the back end, which makes things very easy, and it's very extensible. So back here on the background image, this is actually the GraphQL schema that GitHub has. And it's showing you all these different tables in here, all the different kind of types and things and stuff in the schema. And look at all the lines, all the different connections. So you can build up very complex relationships between things in this architecture very quickly. So I'm very hopeful that that's going to provide a solution. But let's just go back to learning design. How much time have I got? Okay, I'll keep talking. Okay, we're almost done. So data needs to be cooked with care, okay? So back to what I was saying about the visions of learning analytics or how you're going to use your data. You need to be thinking about what you're collecting. Are you collecting all the data you need? Are you just collecting it because it's useful and, you know, your LMS lets you? Like, you know, plenty of people are. What are you trying to build from your data? So what kind of metrics are you trying to produce? And so one of the big findings we've found, oh, perfect, I'm almost done too. So one of the things we've been finding with our project is that if you just go, hey, go and look at some learning analytics dashboards, students will do that, but they don't really do much as a result of it. There's limited reflection. They don't change what they're doing very much at all. And it can be very hard for them to use the analytics unless you provide them with scaffolding. And that scaffolding is learning design, okay? So you really need, when you're thinking about what kinds of visualization and reporting you're going to build, you need to be thinking not in terms of the data and then going to the visualization and then going to, well, how do I use that in assessment or learning design? You need to start with the learning design, then think about what analytics and reporting would help you, and then go to the data. So a lot of people go the wrong way. They think about the data first, and it means they end up with a lot of clickstream data that is useless for the kind of learning they're trying to generate. So this is a really important lesson to be learning, because things can go very wrong with naive approaches. So here's a classic quote from a paper about badges. So our combination of leaderboards, badges, and competition do nothing to improve educational outcomes, and at worst, they're harming motivation, satisfaction, and empowerment. And I have seen so many people building these kinds of solutions where they go, yeah, we'll badge learning and we'll give them a leaderboard because that'll motivate them. But actually, there's been plenty of studies, and this is a good one, showing that students will actually get demotivated. So the top students will go, oh, the leaderboard shows me I'm at the top. Oh, well, I don't need to work so hard then. The student who's at the bottom will be like, oh, I'm at the bottom, and they'll just give up. The students in the middle aren't really affected at all. They don't care. So, you know, that's a classic outcome that you can get from a leaderboard. Every time you go and ask students what they want in learning analytics, so co-design has become very popular, they always say they want a leaderboard. Please don't give it to them. It's bad for them, okay? So these are the kinds of things you need to be very careful about. So one of the things we've done with our project is we've built a number of learning designs that couple to the student-facing analytics, and there's a couple of papers that have come out on that. And basically what they're doing is they're coupling the data to what you're trying to do with it. And they're showing you how you can use the learning analytics in a student-facing context. So they're now feeding into what we're doing with the Learning Analytics API. And over here at the reporting side of the API, what we've got is user configurable dashboards that we're building, where basically you don't show one-size-fits-all dashboards to students. You let academics turn on and off functionality depending on the learning design, and you let students then select what they want to see, because different students want to see different things, but the things they're allowed to see are influenced by what the instructor has let them see, because the instructor knows what is going to be useful or potentially not useful for them. So these kinds of things are now facilitated very quickly because we've put so much effort into thinking about the back-end data infrastructure. So, in summary, why do I use XAPI? Well, learning happens everywhere, okay? And we need to just get over that. Like, we need to actually build our ed tech for that. It's very flexible, which makes it quite future-proof. Rapid development. I can't stand waiting for 3 years for something to happen. I want to build things now if I'm going to be building things, and it lets me do that. And it's a very nice way of modularly linking up data from multiple learning record providers. It still enables data interoperability, but you need to follow best practice. And the thing I really like about it is it's a very open and vibrant community effort, so anyone can contribute to it. And with that, I'm done.
네, 이번에도 플로어에서 먼저 질문 받도록 하겠습니다. 혹시 질문 사항 있으신 분 계실까요?
No question.
없으시면 심플로에 있는 질문들 추천수가 높은 순서로 이제 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 가장 많이 궁금하신 부분들이 이제 XAPI와 칼리퍼의 상호 운용성에 대한 강조를 두 스피커께서 함께 하셨기 때문에 이것들의 미래가 어떻게 될까에 대한 것 같습니다. 그래서 두 표준의 특성을 더한 제3의 표준이 앞으로 나올 거라고 예측하시는지, 아니면 두 표준 중에 하나가 어디가 이겨서 그쪽으로 종속될 거라고 생각하시는지에 대한 질문해 주셨습니다.
My personal preference for harmonisation is Caliper's very strict, which makes it a good profile of XAPI. So from my perspective, XAPI would be the one standard to rule them all, but Caliper would be a subset within XAPI, a profile of XAPI. Now that makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure if Caliper will go for it or not. But the other option, if the two standards can't come together, would be the GraphQL schema. So the schema is actually the thing that does the unification, and the resolvers just go off to Caliper or XAPI statements depending on what the scenario is or where the data is collected from. So it doesn't really matter to me anymore now that I've come up with the schema as a solution. Like I said before, I'm lazy. The idea of doing everything twice is really annoying to me. So my preference would be for harmonisation. It's certainly something that I'm keeping an eye on. So as profiles are developed in XAPI, I think they should be looking to the work that's gone on in Caliper, and they should be trying to adopt the vocabulary and as much of the structure that's gone on there as possible. Because, to be honest, I think, most of the people building Caliper are much better at that stuff than we are. We're a bit Wild Westy. We do what we like. They're much better behaved, so we can probably trust them to do a good job. So it's probably worth using their, for example, ontologies. However, I would be very sad if the only way to develop EdTech was via such a slow and kind of mammoth effort. Like, I think there needs to be loose couplings and sloppiness available, because that's where your innovation comes from. So I'm actually quite, getting more optimistic that there's hope for interoperability between the two specs. I don't think it will come down to one spec, to be perfectly honest. I just don't think the politics will allow it. But I think there's enough people on both sides of the divide who are interested in bringing them together that there should be something. Because let's face it, nobody wants to do everything twice. Hopefully that.
네, 주변에서 표준 활동 열심히 하고 계신 그 분 중에 한 분은 이 두 개의 표준이 상호 운용성을 확보해서 갈 수 있는 새로운 이름으로 X 칼리퍼를 추천하시는 분이 한 분 떠오릅니다, 갑자기. 네, 두 번째 질문은 LRS 솔루션의 시장 현황, 랭킹이라든가 특장점이라든가 혹은 자체적으로 구축한 우수 사례를 알고 싶다라는 질문 주셨습니다.
So I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because I'm much more of a learning record provider and learning record consumer than a learning record store expert. I do think that there are LRSs that I like and there are LRSs I don't like so much. The ones I like tend to be fairly lightweight, but that's because I tend to suck the data out of them and use it somewhere else. So it really depends on what your use case is. My suggestion would normally be to go for one that adheres to the spec as well as you can, because you want the data that's stored in it to be interoperable in other LRSs if you choose to export it down the track. So there was a white paper that was released where I think Rustici, Learning Locker, so Watershed, Learning Locker and Yet Analytics maybe, I can't remember the third one. Oh no, it might have been Saltbox. A few of them got together and were looking at porting data between the different LRSs that they'd set up, and actually they ran into a lot of errors very quickly, even though they were all three of them they thought compliant. And this points to the advantage with the IMS certification process, because that was found post hoc. So, I mean, I like Learning Locker. I like Veracity. They're all pretty much of a muchness, to be perfectly honest. Look for one that uses the most recent version of the spec. Look for one with analytics that is useful for you, like some have it, some don't. And think about how easy it is to get the data out. So it depends on what your problem is more than anything else.
네, 세 번째 질문도 약간 맥이 비슷합니다. 그 XAPI가 굉장히 광범위한 데이터를 수집하고 있는데 교육 분야에 활용하기 위해서는 용어들을 별도로 정의해서 수집하는 것이 필요할 것 같은데 이렇게 하는 것에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지, 괄호치고 캘리퍼와 비슷한 방향이 될 것 같기는 하지만 괄호 닫고입니다.
So the communities of practice basically do that. So what happens is the XAPI profiles are defined by the people who are using that data, and that's open, so anyone can be involved. So if you're trying to generate data, XAPI data of a certain form, and there isn't an XAPI profile available yet, the best way to go forward is probably to try and set up a community of practice. So you can contact ADL about that. There's working groups. There's an IEEE sort of group that I can give you a link to. So there's a number of different ways in which you can get involved in that effort and actually go and define that vocabulary for your specific use case. If you go and look at the profile server, you might well find that information already exists for other profiles and you can just reuse it. So for example, the activity streams profile just takes all of that stuff from activity streams, and that covers an awful lot of the kinds of things that you might be interested in for social data. So we use that for the connected learning recipe. So, and this basically points to one of the really nice aspects of XAPI is that you can get involved and you can influence the spec without having to pay lots of money.
네, 마지막 질문 드리겠습니다. XAPI가 열려져 있는 구조이기 때문에 좀 누구나 참여할 수 있다는 장점이 있지만 이렇게 데이터를 수집하게 되면 좀 더 부정확한 데이터나 잘못된 데이터가 수집될 수 있는 단점이 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이에 대해 어떻게 생각하시는지와 만약에 이에 대해 같이 우려하고 계시다면 이러한 정보를 필터링할 수 있는 방법이 혹시 있을지 궁금합니다.
Work on profiles. So participate in the actively going XAPI profile definition. So basically what you find is people, as they start using XAPI, start generating some statements, and they're legal statements, but they're not very useful, and gradually they get more sophisticated. As you start thinking about trying to port XAPI data between your use case and some other use cases, or you start thinking about trying to build up an entire architecture, for example, then it becomes more and more important to be thinking about interoperability. And then there's lots of good examples to follow, for example, the JISC project or the Apereo project, or, there's a lot of work going on with the IEEE working group. So there's information on the ADL web page about how to get involved with that, or I can give you some links if you come and talk to me. But basically, the data will have as much integrity as you put into it. So it's up to you as a learning record provider to ensure that there is integrity to the data and to make sure you follow best practice if you're concerned about that. A lot of people aren't, and they generate statements that won't be useful beyond their organisation. But I think as data becomes more important and as lifelong learning data is recognised for how valuable it is, I think that problem will go away naturally because it will just be very, very difficult to justify doing your own thing anymore.
네, 혹시 플로어의 질문 마지막 한 번 정도 할 수 있을 것 같은 시간인데요. 있으십니까? 없으시면 네. 오늘 아주 열정적인 강의해 주신 키토 교수님께 큰 박수 보내드리겠습니다. 고맙습니다. 네. 키토 교수님 이제 마지막 슬라이드에 사실 학습 분석의 가치, 우리가 어디까지 학습 분석을 적용해야 될 것인가에 대한 많은 인사이트를 함께 주셨는데요. 저는 사실 개인적으로 학습 분석이 우리 교육 현장에서 뭘 할 수 있을까라고 생각해 보면 1차적으로는 저희가 병원에 가서 엑스레이를 찍거나 뭐 피 검사를 하거나 내시경 검사를 하거나 의사 선생님을 만나게 되면 만나서 먼저 이 사람은 어디가 아픈 것 같으니까 이거에 대해서 좀 저 알아봐야겠다라고 검사를 하게 되거든요. 그 이후에 이제 의사 선생님께서 처방을 데이터에 근거해서 해주시게 됩니다. 이런 역할들이 사실 우리 교육 현장에 학교가 생긴 이래 꽤 오랜 시간이 흘렀음에도 지금까지 사실 잊지 못해 왔는데요. 이런 역할들을 조금이나마 할 수 있는데 많이 기여할 수 있기를 바라고 오늘 지금 논의됐던 XAPI나 칼리페와 이런 표준들이 이런 결과들을 서로 공유하고 더 의미 있는 결과를 만들어내는데 기여할 수 있기를 바라면서 오늘 세션을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 두 분 연사님께 깊이 다시 한번 감사의 말씀 드리고요. 늦은 시간까지 함께해 주신 우리 청중 여러분께도 깊이 감사드립니다. 감사합니다.